Good morning, Jenica here, and happy Sabbath. This is week 5 of our 7-week Pentecost countdown, where we're building anticipation for the celebration of Pentecost, which I think is a way too often overlooked holiday on the Christian calendar. Of course, in Christian tradition, it is celebrated as the day that God poured out the Holy Spirit to the early church in Acts chapter 2, and really launched the early church from that upper room. And in Jewish tradition, it is celebrated as the day that God poured out his law to his people at Mount Sinai. And it's beautiful because both of these pourings out happened 7 weeks after the great celebration of deliverance. Passover in Jewish tradition, which is, of course, the celebration of the Exodus, the deliverance from bondage to Egypt. And in Christian tradition, it's Easter, the celebration of our freedom from sin and bondage to sin. So there are really beautiful parallels between celebrating the great deliverance from bondage, and then 7 weeks later, the outpouring of God's way, God's help to us for how to be his people. And in the last few weeks, we've been talking kind of about a different angle of this every time. And today I want to talk about the original mandate for celebrating Pentecost, because it too has fabulous parallels for us as Christians. It started out as a harvest festival. So we're going to dig into that today. But first, I want to do a really quick review. We've talked about this stuff in the last few weeks, and I've got references back there, but I'm going to do a really quick review here just so we remind ourselves where we're at. God's people. The ancient Israelites were in covenant to be God's people. That was the crux of the whole covenant. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. And of course, that was part of God's great plan to reconcile humans back to himself after the fall in the Garden of Eden. This special people would host his presence, whether in the tabernacle in the wilderness or the temple in Jerusalem. They would host his presence, and the way they would do that is by being holy as he is holy, consecrated, set apart, unique, resembling more God, so that they could actually host his holy presence in the midst of a contaminated world. They would be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and of course priests mediate between heaven and earth for the sake of others, and they would multiply, filling the earth with God's presence. So, again, there are 4 parts to that. They would be God's people. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. They would host his presence by being holy as he is holy. They would be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation to mediate between heaven and earth for others. And they would multiply themselves, filling the earth with God's presence. Now, we may be in a new covenant. We might be under the terms of a new covenant, but the goal is still the same. We, as parties to the covenant, are still expected to be God's people, host his presence, this time within us, by having the Holy Spirit within us, like we talked about recently. We are to be that kingdom of priests and a holy nation who can mediate between heaven and earth for the sake of others. And we are to multiply ourselves by making more disciples, right? That's the Great Commission. Go into all the earth, go into the nations, and make disciples of all nations, so that we can fill the earth with God's presence. So the covenant might be a new covenant, but the goal is still the same: to reclaim the ground lost in the fall and reconcile us humans back to God. The only reason there is a new covenant is because we couldn't uphold our end of the deal under the law. The law, of course, as we've talked about before, was God's set of instructions to his people for how to carry out the covenant, how to be holy as I am holy, so you can host my presence. But of course, as weak humans contaminated by sin, we couldn't carry it out. We proved that over and over and over. So God made the new covenant, under which he offers to completely renew us from the inside out and give us his spirit within us, Ezekiel 36. And this is what empowers us to actually obey now. The Holy Spirit within us is how we can carry out covenant, how we can be holy as he is holy. So the new covenant, I'm reviewing all of this because it's an important point that I want to make. The new covenant is not a home free pass to get saved and check out. We're in covenant. We have work to do here. And in 2 weeks, we will be celebrating the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and the launch of the early church to reach the nations. I will talk about the power to proclaim next week, because the Holy Spirit is what gives us the power to proclaim. But today, here's the cool thing about Pentecost. Originally, Pentecost was mandated in the law. And side note, I absolutely love serving a God that mandates feasts. Thou shalt celebrate. Anyway, Pentecost was mandated as a feast of harvest. Okay, so we're going to talk about the feast of harvest today. In Leviticus 23, God actually mandated 7 holy times, 7 festivals, you could say. The Sabbath was one of them, and of course the Sabbath happens every week. But then there's also the Feast of Passover, and right behind it is the Feast of First Fruits. But then 7 weeks after that is the Feast of Harvest, and that's Pentecost. It's also called the Feast of Weeks because it comes 7 weeks after Passover. Then there's the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Booths. So Leviticus 23 is where God mandated 7 festivals or holy times for the people to celebrate. And like I said, the Feast of Harvest is also called the Feast of Weeks because it comes 7 weeks or 49, 50 days after Passover. So that's where we get the Greek word Pentecost, is from the Greek word for 50 because of the 50-day gap between them. So anyway, Pentecost is a harvest festival. What does God say about it in his Ezekiel? Exodus 23:16. He says, "You shall keep the feast of harvest of the first fruits of your labor of what you sow in the field." Okay, so what you've sown in the field has grown. Now you harvest it and you bring your first fruits. You bring your offering to the festival. Exodus 34:22. You shall observe the Feast of Weeks, the first fruits of wheat harvest, and then another feast at year's end. So he's spelling out what the people are to celebrate and how, of course. And it's really a feast of dedication. So where Passover celebrated salvation, the Feast of the Harvest is really a dedication, like an offering to God. So it talks about the wheat harvest here. And the New Testament, as Christians, we focus a lot on the New Testament, so let's go there. The New Testament talks a lot about the kingdom of heaven being like a seed of grain planted in the ground. Matthew 13, Jesus talks a lot about that multiple times in various parables. And basically what it comes down to is the seed of the kingdom of heaven is sown in us. And Jesus says that he himself is the one who sows the seed, Matthew 13:37. And in a sense, like we talked about last week, the refreshing, the pouring of the Holy Spirit is what waters it. But there are also earthly workers too. Paul tells the church in 1 Corinthians 3:6 that I planted and Apollos watered, another worker watered, but God gave the growth. So the work between seed and growing and harvesting, the growth cycle is really a partnership between us and God in order to get a crop to bear fruit and grow. And the New Testament also talks about how it's necessary for a seed to die in order to bear much fruit. That's in John 12, Jesus says that, and in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that the seed is put in the ground and it dies. But then it, of course, breaks open, grows into a plant, and that plant bears much fruit. Here's the beautiful miracle of crop growth. And all of you gardeners know this a lot better than I do. I'm not a very good gardener. But you know that there's this incredible miracle where you put one seed in the ground, and that seed grows into a plant. And that plant either bears blossoms or fruit of some sort. And that fruit, or those flowers, contain a ton of seeds for more plants. So the seed grows into a plant that bears fruit, and inside that fruit are countless seeds to make even more plants. The plant's action of bearing fruit is the plant replicating itself. Let me repeat that, because I think as Christians we get stuck on passages like Galatians 5 that talk about fruit qualities like love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And we imagine the fruit of our faith being really nice things to look at, or really nice things to taste, really nice qualities to have. But we forget that every blossom, every fruit is the plant replicating itself. The plant's fruit bearing is the plant's self-replication. If it's not bearing fruit, it's as good as dead. Fruit is not just a list of good qualities. Fruit is, at its core, Get it? Apple core. Fruit is, at its core, the seeds of self-replication. That is the purpose of the fruit. Yes, it has good qualities too. It's beautiful to look at. It tastes wonderful. It might smell wonderful. But without the seeds of self-replication, it's empty. And Jesus takes that very seriously. Mark 11 tells the story of Jesus and the fig tree. So in verses 12 through 14, Jesus finds a fig tree in leaf, but without figs. And because on a fig tree, the fruit should be appearing around the same time as the leaves. It's an indication that there is no fruit. This is an unfruitful fig tree. And Jesus curses it. Something to the effect of, may you never bear fruit again. And when they passed by the tree the next day, starting in verse 20, the fig tree was withered to its roots. God takes unfruitfulness very seriously. It's not enough to have pretty leaves. It's not enough to be nice to look at. Maybe the leaves smell great, they look great, whatever. If there isn't the self-replicating fruit, then the plant is useless as a crop. And God is very concerned with fruitfulness. If there is no fruit, then there is no self-replication. And to say it the other way, if there is no self-replication, then there is no fruit. And if you're missing the fruit, then you're also missing the yummy qualities like yummy taste, beautiful view, great smell. But at the core, the fruit is self-replication. And that self-replication is what we are ordered to do as God's people. That was the Great Commission under the New Covenant. And of course, even under the Old Covenant, self-replication was part of the deal. That was the promise God gave to Abraham. Your descendants will be numerous. You will be a great nation. Self-replication was part of the promise. And even before that, self-replication was ordered. Every time there's a big change, God tends to order growth. He tells Noah and his family after the flood, go, be fruitful and multiply. And before that, he told the very first humans in the Garden of Eden, go, be fruitful and multiply. So God takes self-replication and growth very seriously because that is part of his great plan to reconcile this world of humans back to himself. So now, like we talked about last week, we kind of continuing the gardening metaphor, there might be multiple seeds planted in the dirt. And for example, right now in my garden, I have planted seeds. But right now there are a lot of little green shoots coming up, and I'm not sure what's what because there's been a lot of wind, there's a lot of seed stuff in the air, and there's been a lot of stuff landing in the dirt. So I'm not sure if that's Swiss chard carrots or something else. I'm not going to know until the plant has grown enough to start bearing fruit, bearing signs indicating what it is. The fruit proves the plant. The fruit that shows up proves the DNA at work within the plant. James 3:12 says, a fig tree can't bear olives and a grapevine can't produce figs. The fruit proves the DNA at work within it. So there might be multiple plants coming up, but the fruit will eventually prove which plant was most taken care of and helped to grow. So we, as Christians, I think we often focus on the fruit of the nice qualities within us, like how do we be nicer, how do we be sweeter, how do we be all of these nice qualities, and we forget that at the core, the fruit that we are ordered to produce is the fruit of self-replication. Whatever we're producing has to have the seeds in it for more growth. It's not just about make a pretty plant and have really nice leaves. The fruit that we are ordered to produce is the fruit of self-replication. And we work with God towards that. We work with God in sowing and watering and growing and harvesting with the other humans around us too. Sometimes you might be sowing seed. Other times you might be helping water, grow, weed, harvest, whatever. Now, since Pentecost is a celebration of harvest, I'm focusing particularly on the harvesting stage right now. I'm from the Midwest. And in the Midwest, we grow a lot of wheat. Wheat has a relatively short growing season here, probably because our summers are short, makes it a nice crop. It comes up green and it grows. And as it's growing, the fields all look green. It's very pretty when you're driving down the country highways. But then suddenly you have amber waves of grain because when wheat is ready for harvesting, it turns to a creamy golden color and it's harvest time. Jesus talks about harvest time. the time that the gathering can begin. In John 4:35, he tells his disciples, the fields are white for harvest. The fields are ready. Let's start harvesting. And he confirms that it's not just a one-time thing. There's a now ongoing cycle of sowing and reaping. He says the sower and the reaper can rejoice together at the same time. The sowing of seeds and the harvesting of plants can happen simultaneously now with Jesus. And of course, in Matthew 9 and Luke 10, he tells his disciples that the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Anyone who has grown up on a farm can tell you that there is a window of time for harvest. It is not never ending. When it's harvest time, it is all hands on deck. You get friends, you get whoever you can to come help you harvest. And if you are involved in wine production at all, you know that there is a window of time in which you can harvest grapes. And everybody goes out in the vineyard, collects the grapes, and then it's time for making the wine, because there is a window of time in which you can harvest. And then it's too late. The book of Joel, chapter 1, describes an invasion of locusts. And verse 11 says this, despair, you farmers. Be ashamed, O tillers of the soil. Wail, you vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished. There is a window of opportunity, a window of time for harvesting, and then it's too late. When Jesus told his disciples to pray that more workers would be sent to the harvest, the very next thing that happened was them being sent. Matthew 9 ends with, now pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out more laborers into his harvest. And then 10:1, right after that, opens with all hands on deck. And he called to him his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction. And he sent them out. They prayed that the Lord would send more workers to the harvest, and the next thing they know, they are those workers being commissioned. Pentecost is a celebration of the feast of the harvest. Let's meditate together on how we can be preparing to celebrate a harvest. What are we offering to God as our fruit? And what are we offering to God as our first fruits? That phrase always kind of confused me. In 2 Thessalonians 2:13, it says, God chose you as first fruits to be saved. And James 1:18 says, of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. There's a sense of, there's a window of time for harvest, but there's an even smaller window of time for first fruits. And the first fruits are precious. I remember reading Watchman Nee, who was a Christian. He was a Chinese Christian, and he wrote really beautifully about the Christian faith. And in one of the books, I can't remember what it is right now, I'll put it in the comments if I remember, but in one of the books he talks about how his province was known for a particular kind of fruit, and it only blossoms once a year. And I think when we're living in a grocery store culture, we kind of forget that plants follow seasons, and you can only get plums or oranges really at certain times of the year. And he talks about the fact that his province was known for this particular kind of fruit, and the whole harvest was celebrated. Everybody was excited when these fruits came into fruit. When it was harvest time, everybody was excited, but there was something special about the first fruits. Those were the most precious, and they were packaged carefully, and they commanded the highest prices at the market, because there's a preciousness to them that opens up the whole harvest. So as we are preparing to celebrate Pentecost in 2 weeks, and we worship the God of the harvest, let's meditate together on what our harvest looks like and what our first fruits are, and how we can carry out the Great Commission of self-replication, and what kind of fruit we can bring to our King. So next week, I'm going to be talking more about how the Holy Spirit empowers us to proclaim. There is a cycle. There is sowing, watering, growing, harvesting, but the fields are white for harvest now. Pray for more workers to be sent to the harvest before the field perishes, and let yourself be sent to. It's all hands on deck, church. We have work to do, and it's awesome. Before I talk next time, I'm going to give you a few passages here, just so you can read a little bit more about the harvest, or the Harvest Festival, if you're interested. Not a big deal if you don't. It's not like you're going to fall behind, but these are really cool passages if you want to read more about Pentecost in the Old Testament. Exodus 23, verses 14 through 16. Leviticus 23, 15 through 22. Numbers 28, 26 through 31. Deuteronomy 16, 1 through 17. And 2 Thessalonians 2, 13 through 17. I read a snippet of it, but it's a really nice passage to read. And even Revelation talks about harvest in chapter 14. So 14, 15 is a good verse to find. And of course, John 4, as we're talking about the Holy Spirit being the watering and then into harvest, just read John 4 because it's awesome. I will end with that. Do be praying that God would send more workers into the harvest, and do be meditating on what that harvest looks like and what those fruits look like and what we can bring to the King. See you next week.